The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 10th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spent.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Good morning once again. It's good to be here. I sort of went back through my files to sort of figure out when the last time we were here. The last time was in January 2014. And so today is, I think, the 4th visit that either I have made on my own or with Martha on some occasions here to Trundle Springs since the relationship between this congregation and we as ELCA missionaries began. That goes back to 2002. As you can see on this particular visit, Martha's not with me. And so I'm doing all but the last weekend of a 5-week home assignment on my own, and then she's going to be joining me for the last week of that at the end of this week. Since the last time I was here, we've had some family changes. Our 2 adult daughters, continue to get older. Our youngest, a single mom, continues to live with us with her 9-year-old son. Our first grandson, Gabriel, and our oldest daughter, right after our previous home assignment in 2017, got married. And just 2 months ago, she and her husband had their first child. So Martha and I have 2 grandsons now, which we're pretty happy about. I'm missing a lot of time with that newborn grandson, but they're keeping me up to date through photos and videos and whatnot. The other thing I just want to mention, it's in your bulletin insert that gives a thumbnail sketch about the work that I do as an ELCA missionary in Central America. It talks about some pretty significant changes, and I have to say that shortly after I was here the last time, my work as an ELCA missionary in Central America changed dramatically. That began to happen in mid-2014, and I just want to say just a bit about that because that's the contextual backdrop for the reflection that I'm going to share with you today on the gospel reading. If you can remember back, mid-2014 was when the exodus of children and families from Central America began. That was a summer when all the images in the media, including here in the United States, were about unaccompanied children. That was supposed to be a temporary crisis, but the number of people that are fleeing the deadly violence and grinding poverty in their countries of origin, I'm talking about Central America, where I serve, hasn't slowed down. If anything, it's gotten worse. Now, in the face of that crisis, ELCA as a denomination is responding to this situation through what we call our Amparo strategy. Amparo, spelled with two M's, okay, AMMPARO, is an English acronym which actually spells out a Spanish word. The acronym stands for Accompanying Migrant Minors with Protection, Advocacy, Representation, and Opportunities. That's the acronym. The word Amparo in Spanish, spelled with one M, it means to provide refuge and protection to people who are vulnerable. And in fact, it is how the English word refuge in Psalm 46 is translated in many Spanish language Bibles. That first verse says, God is our refuge and strength. Well, in Spanish, many Spanish Bibles say, Dios es nuestro amparo y fortaleza. So that's where the idea of Amparo comes from. I would be happy to share more details about what this means, both for my work and for folks throughout the ELCA during the fellowship hour. But I just want to say briefly that what we're trying to do through Amparo, and this was a strategy approved at the Churchwide Assembly of ELCA back in 2016. What we're trying to do is engage in a holistic mission strategy that basically upholds the basic rights and dignity of migrant children and their families, that tries in some way to address the root causes of why so many children and families are fleeing Central America's Northern Triangle. We are advocating for the just and humane treatment of those migrants wherever they are on that journey. And also, we are working and building upon the knowledge and experience of our global companions and U.S.-based partners, but in the case of Central America, we're talking about our global companions in Central America historically, and I'll talk more about that. So, when I talk about that my responsibilities have been changed, I would say they haven't changed. I haven't changed them. The context has changed what I've done, what I'm expected to do now. One of my key roles with Amparo has been to help ELCA folks understand the why of why children and families continue to flee north by the tens of thousands. And another part of my task is to identify effective ways in Central America for channeling ELCA support to Lutheran churches and to other ecumenical bodies in Central America who are trying to change the circumstances that lead families to conclude that their only option to save themselves and their children is by immigrating. So I'll stop at that point, and after that greeting and introduction, and ask you to sort of look with me at today's gospel reading, which is a very familiar text. It's that parable of the Good Samaritan. We've heard this a lot. We hear it every 3 years in the lectionary. My understanding is during your vacation Bible school this past week, it was one of the texts that they focused on as well. You know, there's some key verses in there that we almost know by memory. Verse 27, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Right? That one's pretty familiar. Then there's verse 29, and that's where this lawyer who thought he was pretty smart, that's where he sort of got himself in a hole, a rhetorical hole, when he said, and who is my neighbor? That's a key question. Verse 31, this is something that actually has made it into our kind of daily vocabulary. That phrase in verse 31 where one by one, the priest and the Levite, they pass by on the other side. They pass by on the other side. And then there's a final phrase in that text in verse 37 where Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. This morning, I think I would like us to focus on that last phrase, go and do likewise. Jesus was lifting up the example of the Samaritan as something to be imitated. So let's take a closer look at how the Samaritan responded. There's not a lot of details, but the details in the text we find in verses 34 and 35. And if you read carefully there, the Samaritan's response began with immediate assistance, life-saving. That's that phrase where he said, he found the guy half dead and he bandaged up his wounds. We call that basic first aid. It's what EMT personnel do when they come on the scene of an accident. And that's important. But if you notice in this text, the Samaritan didn't stop there. Because if the Samaritan would have stopped there, then we have this other phrase in the U.S. we talk about sometime when we're sort of criticizing our responses, especially short-term responses. We talk about that would be a Band-Aid approach. You just try to put a Band-Aid on it. If you put a Band-Aid on somebody who's half dead, that's not going to do a whole lot. So what's the second step? The Samaritan took it upon himself to transport that injured soul to a safer place, to an inn, where that injured man would be safe and could begin the recovery process. Okay? So there's kind of a second phase, if you will, in the Samaritan's response. But you know, he didn't just take him to the inn and sort of dump him there. He still wasn't finished. He spent an entire day there caring for that man, and then he had to move on. We don't know why. But he left some money with the income so that the victim could recover fully. And he promised that innkeeper that he would repay him for any additional expenses that might be incurred after the Samaritan left. So we see kind of a process there, the phases that the response of the Samaritan went through. And you know, as I was reflecting on this text, it's such a familiar text, but thinking about it in the context of what's going on in Central America, I realized that this is very similar to what our Amparo companions do in Central America. These are organizations with years of accumulated experience working with migrants and refugees. They are organizations like the Migrant Ministry Program of the Lutheran Church in El Salvador, the Social Action Commission of the Mennonite Church, the World Service Program of the Lutheran World Federation in Honduras, and an organization called POPNOC in Guatemala. Now, in slightly different ways, but the basic thrust of what they do is similar, these organizations work with children, youth, and families who try to immigrate but fail. So when they're detained and sent back to their countries of origin, they return physically exhausted, emotionally scarred, and economically destitute. They come back worse off than they were when they left. And because there's a legal process when you come back into your country that way, the government is responsible for their initial reception and repatriation. That's the appropriate government role. But that process only lasts a few hours. So once released, returned migrants face the same intolerable conditions that forced them to flee in the first place. And that's where what I would call the Good Samaritan ministry of our Amparo companions begin. It too, like the Samaritan, it starts with immediate assistance. Basic food provision so that children and their families don't go hungry during the first week or so that they're back home, and I'll put that in quotes. Because some of them no longer have a home to go back to. Because one of the common ways for people to save up the money to try to make the migrant journey is they sell off all their assets, or in one of the most nefarious practices, these coyotes, or they pay a guide to take them. And one of the ways, if people don't have cash to pay the guide, what the guide will also do is says, okay, you give me the deed, the title to the house that you live on, and when you pay me off, I'll give it back. And if you don't pay me off, I'm going to take your house. So that's when I say they may not even have a home to go back to. But at least when they set foot back into their home country, they have something to eat. Then it moves a little bit to that next phase, what we might call it the recovery phase, medical attention. Because a lot of people come back badly beat up. But you know, beyond the physical scars, one of the things that we've learned over these past 4 or 5 years is about how important it is to provide psychological counseling for the multiple traumas that returned migrants have suffered during their odyssey through Mexico and in U.S. detention facilities for those that make it that far. A lot don't. I just want to share one example about a young widow. Her name is Heidi. She's from Honduras. I met Heidi in March of this past year during the visit of an ELCA delegation to El Salvador and Honduras, focusing on the work of our Amparo companions. It actually included our presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eden. Now, Heidi grew up in a place called Chamelecon. Chamelecon is one of the toughest neighborhoods in one of the most violent cities in the entire world, and I'm talking about the city of San Pedro Sula in Honduras. At the age of 16, Heidi left home and started a family. She had 2 girls, born 6 years apart. And shortly after the birth of her second child, her husband was murdered. At that point, because of the circumstances around that crime, she and her daughter's lives were also at risk. So she decided that the best option to care for her daughters was to leave and to take both of her daughters with her, and that's what she did. She made it to the U.S. I think she made it to someplace in Texas and began working there shortly thereafter. Now, think about this. A young widow, a single mom, she needed to work. So obviously, if you got 2 small children, you got to figure out, okay, who am I going to leave my kids with? And she did have someone to take care of her daughters. What she told us, she left them in the care of a cousin. But one day while she was at work, her youngest daughter fell, hit her head, was rushed to the hospital, and died a few days later. And to make matters worse, at the time that this tragedy was unfolding with her younger daughter, she got picked up. And originally, it was for an immigration infraction. But later, they changed the charges, and they charged her with homicide for the death of her daughter. I'm not sure how they arrived at those charges, but that's what they did. And she spent 18 months in jail. And finally, those homicide charges were dropped. But her ordeal was not yet over. She was transferred into the custody of ICE to be deported. And at that point, then, the key question is, remember, she had 2 daughters, the younger one that died and the older one. So what was going to happen to her older daughter? And during her imprisonment, she tried to work with a lawyer to legally transfer custody of that daughter to a relative. She had a stepmother living nearby in the U.S. and also an uncle. But for whatever reason, Child Protective Services in that area said no. So in the end, the only option presented to her was to voluntarily give her child up for adoption to complete strangers in exchange for one last brief visit with her daughter before Heidi was put on a plane and sent back to Honduras. She really was backed in the corner. She didn't know what else to do, so she agreed. But she also agreed with the understanding that this would be sort of like an open adoption where she would be able to remain in contact with her daughter via letters, maybe phone calls, maybe Facebook. But what she realized when she was back in Honduras, that the mailing address that she had been given by the adoptive family was false. There was no way to find the phone number. That Facebook page never materialized. Right? This is just part of one case of the many that I've heard like this over the past years. So going back to what I said about the importance of psychological attention for these people, just imagine Heidi's psychological state when she got back to Honduras. One daughter dead, the other one, you might say, symbolically dead because she had no way to be in contact with her. So in emotional and psychological terms, she was half dead. I don't think it's an oversight. Not unlike the guy on the road that the Samaritan came across. It's different context. But the good news in this is that fortunately, she got connected with the Mennonites in Honduras after her deportation. And that's an organization that is helping her get back on her feet psychologically, economically, and spiritually. And this story is repeated with hundreds of cases. So we were in that second recovery phase. We were talking about medical attention and psychological attention. Then after that, if you don't deal with the trauma that these folks have been through, then helping them sort of reestablish their lives in their country or community of origin is not going to work. But once you've dealt with that, then you can think about things like re-enrolling children in school, if children are sent back. Or in the case of teenagers who maybe aren't that interested in going back to school, but they also don't have clarity on what they want to do with their lives. So they walk them through life skills workshops for them to figure out a plan. What am I going to do with myself now? For many, technical training is the preferred option so that they can find paid employment. And oftentimes, paid employment is really important. Remember what I said about the debts that they came back with? They have to figure out a way to pay off that debt that they acquired. And for the most entrepreneurial within this population, they actually receive training in seed capital to start up small businesses. So that's kind of how the process works, if you will, with the Good Samaritan ministry with one of our companions in Honduras. But what I would like to add here is that Amparo isn't only about merciful and compassionate care for migrants in Central America. The same dynamics are at work among ELCA members and congregations who are part of the Amparo network here in the United States. So let's look at that again. Let's walk through that three-step process again. Immediate assistance for children and families upon their release from those overcrowded and inhumane conditions in the ICE detention centers that we've been hearing so much about on the news. Once they are released from those facilities, it's not unlike what happens in Honduras. They're sort of released, they're sort of dumped out, and then they have to fend for themselves. But I can tell you, we have ELCA congregations along the border in places like El Paso, Texas, and Las Cruces, New Mexico, who are there to sort of provide that initial first aid, if you will. And then, after that phase, then people are moved to other parts of the country where they will wait out their legal process in the care of either relatives or sometimes foster families. And that's where we have a program. It's called ELCA Welcoming Congregations. We have nearly 150 of those all around the country. So they're like the innkeepers in the story, in the Good Samaritan story from Luke's Gospel. But then if we want to talk about a road to full recovery, in truth, full recovery can't take place with people who enter the United States to seek asylum until their legal claim has been presented, heard, and decided in immigration court. And there, to help in that process, we have ELCA lawyers who donate their time and travel to detention facilities to help unaccompanied children and families prepare their cases. And we have church volunteers who serve as part of what's called the Guardian Angel program, and they actually personally go with children and families when they have a hearing before an immigration judge to basically provide, I would just say, pastoral care accompaniment while people are going through a very complex and hard to understand process, even if you know English, and it's worse when you don't. Once again, what is happening is a Good Samaritan ministry. Returning to our gospel reading, it bears mentioning that there is a truly major source of scandal in this text. I don't think we pick it up. But if we would have been in the original hearers of this parable when Jesus was telling the parable, the source of that scandal is that Jesus chose a Samaritan to illustrate the ethical behavior that he expected of his followers and that he expects of us. For the original hearers of the parable, the phrase Good Samaritan would be an oxymoron. They would never have put those two words together, because Samaritans and Jews did not get along. Samaritans were looked down upon and even despised by good synagogue-going Jews. And you know, Jesus knew this, and nevertheless, he used the scandalous example of the Samaritan to make a point. And we might ask ourselves, why did Jesus teach in a way that he knew would generate discomfort and even scandal for his immediate disciples and the other Jewish listeners? And all I can think of is, I think he was not only giving a commission, but maybe issuing a warning. Something like this: you can be a good Jew, go to synagogue, know Jewish law, and even be able to cite key passages from that law, and then pass by on the other side. So that's one option. Or you can be like the Samaritan, who was not welcome or allowed in most Jewish synagogues, who may or may not have been familiar with Jewish law, but when faced with the choice of passing by on the other side or stopping to help someone in need, he chose the latter. Jesus comes down on the side of the Samaritan. So those words, "go and do likewise," are meant for us as well, lest we fall into the same trap of thinking that being a faithful Christian is limited to attending worship, maybe being part of a Bible study, serving on a church council, or maybe one of the other, I don't know how many committees you have here, but churches have a lot of committees, and people are needed on those committees. And there's a myriad of other church activities that take place inside the four walls of our church buildings. But I think what Jesus is saying in this text, he's calling us to a higher standard. There has to be a coherence between what we have been taught in the synagogue, in our churches, in our Sunday schools, in our vacation Bible schools. There needs to be a coherence between those teachings and how we respond to the battered and bruised of our world, of our nation, and of our communities. Jesus' calling is short, it's clear, it's not hard to understand, it's unequivocal, but it's also radical, I would say. Go and do likewise. Amen.